College football nerds here talking Penn State and Ohio State. It's been a minute, so we wanted to talk to y'all. Make sure we don't go too far down the season without bringing y'all back into the fold. We've got it's Nerd Josh, but it's Halloween. If you want to see him as a pirate, you got to go watch our other video, which, by the way, is a great discussion. We did a top 10, but there's a lot of back and forth in discussing the overall landscape of college football. We did some maybe a little bit of elevating Big Ten and putting down the SEC discussion there as well. Really good talk about Ohio State, so go check that out. Josh it's a Halloween costume. He was a pirate. He said he's Fallout Boy, so we'll go with that. All right, Josh. In this game, it's interesting because a lot of people say, "Well, why would you cover this?" One, we're kind of sick of doing SEC games, and two, I think there's some interesting storylines here. And I want to start with something we touched on in our top 10. Iowa is an underrated team. They're on the cusp of being top 25, and we don't love that hard line anyway. They're a good football team. Penn State gave them all they wanted with a backup quarterback. Is there anything you take from that that's like, hey, this is positive, and I think I could see some of this against Ohio State, or was that just kind of a dead cat bounce?
Well, I do think Iowa is a good team. I mean, I think Iowa is a legitimate top 25 quality team. I mean, Penn State was in a difficult situation, losing the coach. That Grunkemeyer at quarterback had 93 passing yards. You could understand pretty quickly why Aller was the starter there. I do think there's some good takeaways, Daniel, because when you look at what Iowa has been to this point in the season, I mean, Iowa's been actually a pretty effective team offensively. I memean, not great, certainly, but I mean, Penn State would defensively handle them just as well. Wisconsin lost 37-0, but only gave up 4.4 yards per attempt, 109 yards passing. Offensively, Iowa has had their struggles, but they have moved the ball pretty well. They've got a decently good run game. I think the thing that really, was impressive, or at least impressive given where Penn State has been, is that they did hold up, relatively well. They did actually play decently good on defensively. They did play as well enough offensively to keep themselves in the game, despite not really having a quarterback. The run game in particular for Penn State has been a bit of a disappointment, but they had the most yards rushing on Iowa than anyone's had this year. Highest yardage per carry total, highest total yardage, 173 yards rushing. And so I do think there's some bright spots there that Penn State maybe is not so dead in the water that they can't be salvaged. But, Daniel, I also think the reality is that they still threw for 3.3 yards per attempt. This is still a team in our metrics that's, hovering in the 30 to 40 range as an overall team. And the thing that I think is the most problematic from a Penn State perspective is that it's been all season, right? And we can have a long conversation with that Oregon-Penn State game on what that meant, right? Was that the high watermark for Penn State and they lost that game and lost all their intensity? Or was that a game, and we sort of went back and forth on this a lot in our top 10, that maybe ought to be an indictment on Oregon? Because when you look at Oregon in that game and also the Iowa game, which was a close game as well for Oregon, does that kind of indicate Oregon, Penn State, and Iowa are all in the same ballpark? But when you start to have that conversation, Daniel, if you were to start to argue, well, maybe Oregon, Iowa, and Penn State are all in the same ballpark, if you're willing to say that and say it's not just about pure wins, losses, but from a quality, and we say this all the time, wins and losses aren't really helpful from a predictive standpoint. Who's going to win the next game? It's vital when you're ranking teams, figuring out who's going to be in the playoff. We've never disagreed with that. But when you talk about how hard it is to beat a team, how hard it is to, how good a team is, how likely they are to win a game, how big of a deal it was to have beaten them, wins and losses themselves aren't that important. And so, maybe there's something to the fact that Penn State actually is kind of in the realm of Oregon and Iowa. Maybe the UCLA game and the Northwestern game were a bit of an aberration. And if you feel them that way, they're not a terrible team. I mean, they're not at all the team that they were made out to be, but they're also a team that's maybe a little more dangerous than they're being given credit for.
On the other side of the fence, there's Ohio State, who's been pretty dominant this year. We noted in our top 10 that Ohio State can't help their schedule, and they've beaten everybody. Like, we disagree with some Ohio State fans on whether or not the Washington game was a blowout. It wasn't a blowout. With 5 minutes to go, it was 17-6. What it was, though, and what I think that Ryan Day is smartly doing so far this year, is he's just concerning himself with game control. He wants to get up by 2 scores and run the clock out. And that's in modern college football. So people are so used to RPO era, 55-10 type scores, really crazy scaling issues. We don't see a lot of that anymore. Shortened games means fewer possessions, means it gives underdogs opportunities to get back in the game artificially sometimes. And Ohio State hasn't had that. And that's the number one thing that, everybody's talking about the defense. And I've said my piece on the defense. I think it's phenomenal. I think the thing that's kind of under the radar right now is that Ohio State has had significant game control, even in the 1-score win against Texas that everybody wants to ding them for, which I do not. They are right to say, you can look at the box score all you want, but if you watch that game, you never felt like Ohio State was going to lose it. And I think that's true. And I think that's how it's been all year this year. But Josh, I do think at some point, if you're Ohio State, you want to see them beat somebody 40-10, right? Like I keep saying this about Alabama, why I've kind of got them lower than other people, because yes, they went through the toughest stretch anybody's had in the country, but they haven't really truly looked dominant. Ohio State's looked more dominant, but I also think that at some point, doesn't it feel like they need to kind of take the reins off the offense, really get after it, and just kind of beat somebody 40-10, and maybe is this that game?
It could be. They've been pretty dominant overall. They've been, I don't think 34-0, 42-3 is anything to shake a stick at. Now we kind of flagged, and I think it's held true. Minnesota defensively has been proven to be, especially in pass defense, a pretty poor unit. So that wasn't so shocking. But the thing that's been interesting in Ohio State, and we flagged it, and people took it as a massive negative because we were looking in isolation as Ohio State, as we often do. We talk a lot about the teams at the very top of the totem pole. Ohio State's clearly the top of the totem pole, right? So you start to have to nitpick a little bit with what potential weaknesses are. And we're flagging like, hey, one of the very slowest rates of drive rates to score in the country, meaning the average. At one point, I think it was over 9 plays a drive they were averaging on scoring drives, which was by far one of the longest rates in the country. Of teams with good offenses, it was far and away the longest rate. And when you start to sort of flesh out how their offense works, particularly in the passing game, it's a little jarring how they in Alabama flip. Because, the thing that flew under the radar is we talked last week before the South Carolina game on Twitter about how Alabama's deep passing game was extremely suspect. They were not throwing the ball deep over the top hardly at all. Alabama attacks a lot between 10 to 30 yards downfield. They attack the seams a lot. They're very aggressive. They trust Ty Simpson over the middle, but they don't throw over the top. They don't really have a deep ball, or they haven't to this point in the season. And Ohio State, Daniel, is really weirdly the opposite. And to sort of exemplify that, just as a simple statistic here, I was going through and I was looking at pass plays of, let's say like 10 plus yards versus 40 plus yards. Okay. 10 plus yard pass plays. Alabama's third in the country. They've thrown 102. And if you look for Ohio State, they're down at 63rd. They've only thrown 71. It's a similar deal. If you look at 20 plus yard pass plays, Alabama's 18th in the country. Ohio State, you got to scroll. Way down at the bottom, 87th. Okay, so 18th in the country for Alabama in 20 plus yard pass plays, 87th for Ohio State. But then if you look at plays of 40 yards or more passing, Ohio State's 7th in the country. Alabama's 64th. And I don't know, Daniel, if I could give you a better example of Ohio State actually throws over the top a lot by national standards. 30-yard pass plays, 40-yard pass plays are pretty high on those lists. And they throw a ton, I said, 70, whatever. They've played one less game. They played a pretty good amount underneath as well. But it's that 20 to 30 yard range where they're really not attacking. They're either going to float the ball over coverage or they're going to attack you underneath in the short passing game. I think it's kind of interesting because the offensive line is clearly a huge step better. For making the comparison with Alabama, they've got a ton more time to throw with Sayin. I think they're relying a lot on Sayin's accuracy and decisiveness in the short passing game. And I think they're trying to protect him a little bit because he's a much younger player and they don't need him to throw over the middle and he's a little less seasoned. There's no reason to take those risks unnecessarily. And, I'll give credit throwing the ball downfield. I kind of flag like, hey, they weren't doing it a whole lot. But then the Minnesota game, they open it up. They show they can at least hit targets when they're open down the field. Sayin can lay it out and put air on the ball. Alabama in the South Carolina game had guys wide open, and Ty Simpson could put air under the ball and float it to the guys going downfield, right? But to your point, you kind of waiting for Ohio State to open things up. And Daniel, it's interesting to me because when you talk about that, everybody conceptually thinks when you're playing like an FCS team, opening it up means throwing bombs down the field over coverage. That is not realistic in the modern world of college football because everybody's running cover 3, cover 4. You should not have guys wide open running beyond coverage. Talked about the Minnesota game. Minnesota's corners are standing flat-footed and getting run by. That means you're not bailing properly in cover 3, cover 4. Just should not happen. Those coverage schemes are designed that you should always be bailing and giving as much depth as possible to keep them in front of you. And the point of that is, as you're bailing, it's the 20 to 40 yard throw where you over bail and now you give up that deep dig or deep comeback or curl. I think that's the area where Ohio State's really got to start attacking if they really want to open the offense up and they want to create explosives. I mean, the running game is good. It's not, setting the world on fire. We have them 29th opponent adjusted. I know they're 66th, I think, nationally, but they've played pretty good competition in run defense. So they're a top 30 rush team. Still 14th in passing yard per attempt. But if they want to go from 8.7, which is very good, to the actual like Heisman 10, 11, 12 yard per attempt numbers we've seen from, Joe Burrow or Kyler Murray or that kind of guy, Jaden Daniels, it's the 20, 30, 40 yard pass plays, attacking underneath those cover 3 shells that they're going to have to attack. And I think there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem of, yeah, that's what we want to see them open it up. But at the same time, if they continue to be able to go 10 to 12 plays in a drive and complete every 80+% of passes they want to throw underneath for less than 10 yards to Tate and Jeremiah Smith, who are always going to catch it and make a play out of it, why do you even bother throwing over the middle or throwing those 20 to 40 yard throws and risking a negative play? I agree with you. It's kind of this interplay of everything where it's easy to be critical, but we're being critical of things Ohio State hasn't shown. And I want to see it because I want to know it's there when they get to the playoffs to do it. But they've also not really given me any indication that they absolutely can't do it if they have to. I just like to see it.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, I know I said 40-10 and the margins are technically better. Like Ohio State beat Wisconsin 34-0, but Sayin had a touchdown pass in the fourth quarter with like 5 minutes to go. I think they could have beaten Wisconsin more than they did. I think they could have beaten Minnesota more than the 14 points they had in the fourth quarter, more than they did. But they were focused on game control. And I also think to do this, and this is partly, we keep going back to Alabama because there's similarities here because they focus on the pass game so much, they need to run it better. And I'll be interested to see how they run it against Penn State because Penn State has a good run defense. Now, you'll point the 250 that they gave up to Iowa or the 250 that they gave up on the ground to UCLA, but those are quarterback yards. In terms of like traditional running backs, I'm going to be looking at the running game a lot more than intermediate passing, just because I do think that Ohio State knows if they need to throw themselves out of trouble, they can. And they're probably going to use this game a little more to work on the things that they've not been great at. And I don't think they've been a bad run team, but I think that, that 66 yard per carry number is not great. I do agree. It's fair to point out that it comes down to 29-30 when you adjust for opponents, but they want to be a top 10 run team. And right now they're not. So that's a huge opportunity, I think, for me. Josh, we talk all the time about how underdogs, like I've been saying it all year, underdogs, the way that they win games or are close in some of these games late against superior opponents is when the offense goes in and kind of messes around. Because the games are shortened now. You get 9-10 possessions tops. And if you mess around with a few of those with 3 and outs, maybe a turnover, you look up in the fourth quarter and it's a tight game. Give me the maybe not realistic, but maybe, it's a 20-point spread. I think 20 and a half. Give me the path, the somewhat feasible path in this game you could see where we look up. We can see throughout the game that Ohio State is the more superior team, but we look up in the fourth quarter and it's 17-13. What is that? Is that how it is, or is it a track meet?
I mean, I almost certainly think it has to be a low scoring game because of the quarterback situation, right? But Daniel, the thing you flagged was quarterback yardage, and I think it's more than just a run issue, because if you really watch that Oregon Penn State game, and I flagged it at the time as something I thought was, to me, a little bit of a red flag, frankly, with Dante Moore, which I'm still kind of tracking. Penn State had real issues containing the quarterback in every way, shape, or form, running or throwing. And with Moore in Oregon, and where Oregon really got Penn State at the end of the game and pulled away, was that Dante Moore is an exceptional thrower on the run. And Penn State could do nothing, it seemed like, to keep him in the pocket. And that let him get outside and throw. And they kind of had the same issue with UCLA in a couple different ways, with Nico as a little bit as a runner, but also as a passer. They couldn't contain him. And Nico's a guy that if you keep him pressured and get him off his feet, he completely crumbles. He's a really interesting prospect that we evaled pretty early in his career at Tennessee, and noted even when he was putting up phenomenal numbers really early in his career, that if you made him reset his feet, suddenly his mechanics kind of went to hell. Penn State couldn't do that to Nico. They couldn't make him reset his feet. Iowa, they also had problems, just keeping the quarterback contained. And the thing that if you were to say the realistic possibility, Sayin is a hyper-accurate passer, but he is not a particularly good athlete. I mean, he can run well enough. He's mobile enough. Don't get me wrong. I'm not insulting the kid. He's not Justin Fields. Okay, he's just not. He's not hyper-mobile. He's not hyper-athletic. He's not going to run through tackles. He's a pretty small kid from a frame thickness perspective. People talk about his height, whether or not he's 6 foot or 6'1" or what have you. But regardless, that's still shorter for a quarterback. He's a pretty small stature quarterback, not overly mobile. And so if there's a potential avenue, I would say to this, Daniel, for them to keep the game close for Penn State, it's going to be the fact that maybe they can manage Sayin in the pocket, and Ohio State can't really exploit that. And Ohio State plays a more traditional football game. And maybe some of this has to do with Jim Knowles and his inability to adapt with that roster to mobile quarterbacks. And to keep containment, being maybe too aggressive at times, and at other times just not knowing how to balance that aggression to be attacking from the outside and be creative. But maybe Sayin doesn't, the way Ohio State attacks you, I don't think really demands you to be that creative, frankly. That's kind of the drawback to their scheme, is while it can be very effective and it's very simple and it's very easy to implement, I think, for quarterbacks, the way they run it with Ryan Day, they become a lot more pro style, but they're still RPO based. The flip side to it is it's not particularly tricky, frankly. And so I don't think defensively you got to do with a lot of things outside your box. So if I were to try to put out the way that Penn State could potentially keep it close, and I'm not saying it's going to happen at all, which we'll get to the prediction later, but that to me is the route, that Ohio State is a little too traditional, as you said, kind of just mess around offensively, same way, like Alabama versus South Carolina. What really happened? Well, they went 3 and out 5 times in that game, and suddenly they found themselves in a ball game. That's the route for Ohio State struggling with Penn State, and it really all comes down to not being particularly creative, not creating explosives or being aggressive. If you don't create explosives, it means you need to have like 10 plus play sequences to score. That gives a lot of opportunities for negative plays, be it holding calls, missed blocks, missed assignments. And if you're not being creative and you allow yourself to be inconsistent, suddenly your offensive scoring efficiency, which Ohio State, it's our biggest knock on them in their model, their scoring efficiency is not particularly high. That can cause you problems and end up being in a closer game than you maybe should be, even if you're dominating the game statistically.
All right, Josh, give us the model and give us your score.
Well, the model, what's interesting to me, it's 30-12, is that it's not far off from the point spread, right? A 20.5 point spread as of our recording. The model has this game 18. It's only given 2 points, despite the fact that Penn State is without their starting quarterback in Aller, and the backup has not looked good. I think that probably says a lot to the fact that Penn State is predicted to be scoring near their floor, and they don't even think Aller would help that much. I think what Vegas is really suggesting is it's kind of putting a cap on how much do you think Ohio State's going to bother to score in the game, frankly. I think Vegas is probably right. I'm going to pick this game 31-13. So I'm technically picking Ohio State not to cover. Now, that's a dangerous thing because Ohio State's been covering at a very high clip lately. But like a lot of these games, Daniels, these point spreads have been really high for a reason. You are, to a certain degree, and I feel like I'm this way, kind of guessing about how aggressive Ohio State is, how comfortable they are building a lead and keeping a lead, and also just how consistently they've played. They've played overly consistently, and they've also been willing to keep Sayin in to give him extra reps, which has made the scores bigger. And people don't want to hear it. It's not at all a knock because Ohio State's controlled these games completely. But the reason they've been winning against the spread is they've had big margins, and they've been willing to exceed those margins and keep exceeding them. So it's a lot of their obviously they've exceeded the spread in some of the couple good games they've played, but the rest they've just kind of been willing to go above that from a score perspective. I think this game they're probably going to be less willing to do that. And I also think Penn State probably has enough pride and they're a good enough team that it's going to be a little bit harder to, run that score up casually, if you want to take it that way.
I think Ohio State covers, but I think it's a lot like maybe the Illinois game or a lot like some of the other games they've had this year where they're not trying to beat somebody 55-10. They've got Penn State, Purdue, UCLA, Rutgers, and Michigan left. So they have, no offense to Penn State, but right now, kind of a broken team. They've got a lot of crap between here and Michigan. There is no reason why they need to put whatever they've held back so far on their playbook on tape. There is no reason why they need to do anything but go all out to try to ambush Michigan. I don't think Ohio State even cares if they win the Big Ten championship game, which I would, obviously, since I have them favored over everybody in the country, I would have them favored in that game. I think Ohio State wants to beat the crap out of Michigan. And so right now, they are worried about game control, getting a 2-score lead, and just kind of keeping it vanilla. And so it's not fun as a fan to watch. It's not fun for me to watch. But I think that's what we got in them for now. So give me 34-10 and probably not even as close as that score. And I hate it for Penn State because, and any Penn State fans who are watching this that didn't see my rant, I did what I think is a video that y'all probably love, based on the concept of there's a lot of people saying who does Penn State think they are to fire a guy that was in the playoffs last year that wins 10 games a lot. And I kind of busted up that whole, concept. And so you should go check it out. I'll link in the description. But I think Penn State fans deserve better than they've got this year by a margin. I think that what was put on the field this year is so inexcusable for what the fans put into that program. So I hope that they find a good coach and really turn it around. And the Big Ten needs them too. The Big Ten was counting on them to be one of those 4 big teams for them this year, and it hasn't panned out. And I hope that they quickly get back. Josh, give us a outro final note on this one, and I'll wrap it up.
I'll add one thing on that discussion with Franklin because I wasn't around vacationing, and guys never have kids. Two stomach flus in 2 weeks is not fun. But the reality with Franklin, even when he was hired, is people talk about 9-win seasons at Vanderbilt, and I've dating back years to when he was hired, I've always tried to point out that was a bit of a mirage because they were 9-win seasons, but he actually went 8-4 in the regular season. One of those years was 2012. They pulled Auburn. That was the year they went 3-9, and they pulled Ole Miss, and they were 5-7. It was Matt Luke, and then the last year when they fired Chizik. And in the Franklin's tenure at Vanderbilt, they were 1-8 versus ranked teams. And those 9-4 seasons, I believe they were 1-5. They beat Georgia once, and that was a Georgia team under Mark Richt that had some injuries in that game. I think Gurley was actually out hurt. And so I've always argued, the way that things kind of panned out at Penn State really, frankly, was no different than he was at Vanderbilt. I mean, if they had pulled in 2012 Texas A&M and Alabama out of the SEC West, they would have gone 6-6. Rather than a 9-win team, you would have been talking about a 6-win team. He had a tremendous amount of scheduling luck in a period where the SEC East was really weak. Florida ended up firing their coach. Georgia ended up firing their coach. They pulled Ole Miss, who fired a coach from the West. They pulled Auburn, who fired the coach. They was there when Derek Dooley was there and on his way out. So it was Dooley, Muschamp, McElwain, I think, at Florida, were the two coaches. Just really weak period. And I agree with you. I mean, I've always argued this idea of loyalty to coaches is silly. And people talk about, well, coaches can leave, but players can't. Well, coaches also should be fired in a moment's notice. And when you're getting $30-50 million in these buyouts that these guys are, and then, I don't make this kind of money, but I exist in this world. Those golden parachutes exist for a reason. You understand if you're not getting the job done, you're going to get fired. He's not gotten the job done. And they've won the games they should win in a division for a long time where it was quite possible. Frankly, the Big Ten has a pretty low floor, which we talk about in our top 10 video. It's just the reality of the conference. And Ohio State routinely, or Penn State routinely in these games versus Ohio State or anybody else, Michigan, whoever, they've shown that there's a big gap between them and the top of the conference. It wasn't just like they weren't getting it done. They were frequently not really competitive. Penn State should expect better than that. They're a better program than that. They've frankly recruited better, that they should have done better than that, and they're capable of recruiting at a level to do a lot better than that. And you don't have to accept mediocrity. And the example that we often give is Georgia, who for years had the same argument that Mark Richt had the record number of 10-win seasons. And the point always made there is like, yeah, because he got hired in 2005 when they added the 12th game. And so, yeah, they won a lot of 10-win seasons, but they would have been 9-win seasons if you look at it for most of his tenure. And I thought they were capable of a lot more. They got a much better coach in Kirby Smart, and they were capable of a lot more. Penn State, I think, has the same kind of setup for success. Maybe not the same narrow recruiting hotbed. When you look at Virginia and Maryland, the D.C. area, there is a lot of five-star talent in that region that can be accessed. And I think Penn State can do it done better. So, I'm glad they moved on. We've been very critical of them from a certain Penn State fans' view, but I know the loyal fans, we've got some really fantastic fans, Penn State fans that watch this channel know, I think we've always been fair with who they are, and we've been critical because we expect more, and we knew where they are, and we knew where they wanted to be, and we knew they weren't there. And if they get the right coach and they move in the right direction, I'm more than happy to meet them on their way and give them credit when they get to the sort of tier they want to be at within college football.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on this one. Please remember to go check out the Penn State James Franklin video that we did, and also the top 10 from this week. I do think that y'all will enjoy it. It's the best video we've done this year. So if you want like a long podcast of just deep dive discussion on conferences and teams and just general college football, you'll love it. Give us a score in the comments and we'll get down there with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week and God bless.